What a funny dream, Sophie said. It's a ring beller, the BFG said. It's Wopsy. Inside the jar, just below the edge of the label, Sophie could see the putting to sleep dream lying peacefully on the bottom, pushing gently, sea green like the other one, but perhaps a trifle larger. Do you have separate dreams for boys and for girls? Sophie asked. Of course, she said. If I was giving a girl's dream to a boy, even if it wasn't really Wopsy girl's dream, the boy would be waking up and thinking, what a rot-bunging, grinkle-sludging old dream that was. Boys would, Sophie said. These here is all girls' dreams on this shelf, the BFG said. Can I read a boy's dream? You can, the BFG said, and he lifted her to a higher shelf. The label on the nearest boy's dream jar read as follows. I is making myself a marvelous pair of suction boots, and when I put them on, I is able to walk straight up the kitchen wall and across the ceiling. Well, I is walking upside down on the ceiling when my big sister comes in, and she is starting to yell at me, and she always does, yelling, what on earth is you doing up there, you walking on the ceiling? And I looks down at her, and I smiles, and I says, I told you, you was driving me up the wall, and now you has done it. I find that one rather silly, Sophie said. Boys wouldn't, the BFG said, grinning. It's another ring beller. Perhaps you has seen enough now. Let me read another boy's one, Sophie said. The next label said, the telephone rings in our house, and my father picks it up and says in his very important telephone voice, Simpkin speaking. Then his face goes white, and his voice goes all funny, and he says, what? Who? And then he says, yes, sir, I understand, sir, but surely it is me you is wishing to speak to, sir, not my little son. My father's face is going from white to dark purple, and he is gulping like he has a lobster stuck in his throat. And then at last he is saying, yes, sir, very well, sir, I will get him, sir. And he turns to me and he says in a rather respectful voice, is you knowing that President of the United States? And I says, no, but I expect he is hearing about me. Then I is having a long talk on the phone and saying things like, let me take care of it, Mr. President. You'll bungle it up all if you do it your way. And my father's eyes is goggling right out of his head, and that is when I is hearing my father's real voice saying, get up, you lazy slob, or you will be late for school. Boys are crazy, Sophie said. Let me read this next one. Sophie started reading the next label. I is having a bath, and I is discovering that if I press quite hard on my tummy buttons, a funny feeling comes over me, and suddenly my legs is not there, nor is my arms. In fact, I has become absolutely invisible all over. I is still there, but no one can see me, not even myself. So my mummy comes in and says, where is that child? He was in the bath a minute ago, and he can't possibly have washed himself properly. So I says, here I is. And she says, where? And I says, here. And she says, where? And I says, here. And she yells, Henry, come up quick. And when my daddy rushes in and I'm washing myself, and my daddy sees the soap floating around in the air, but of course he is not seeing me, and he shouts, where are you, boy? And I says, here. And he says, where? And I says, here. And he says, where? And I says, here. And he says, the soap, boy, the soap is flying in the air. Then I press my tummy button again, and now it's visible. My daddy is squiffy with excitement, and he says, you is the invisible boy. And I says, now I is going to have some fun. So when I is out of the bath and I have dried myself, I put on my dressing gown and slippers, and I press my tummy button again to become invisible, and I go down into the town and walk in the streets. Of course, only me is visible. Only me is invisible, but not the things I is wearing. So when people is seeing a dressing gown and slippers floating along the street with nobody in it, there's a panic with everybody yelling, a ghost, a ghost! And people is screaming left and right, and big, strong policeman is running for their lives. And best of all, I see Mr. Grummet, my algebra teacher, coming out of a pub, and I float up to him and say, boo! And he lets out a frightsome howl and dashes back into the pub, and then I is walking up and feeling happy as a whip squibbler. Pretty ridiculous, Sophie said. All the same, She couldn't resist reaching down and pressing her own tummy button to see if it worked. Nothing happened. Dreams is very mystical things, the BFG said. Human beings is not understanding them at all. Not even their brainiest professors is understanding them. Has you seen enough? Just this last one, Sophie said. This one here. She started reading. I has written a book, and it is so exciting nobody can put it down. As soon as you has read the first line, you are so hooked on it, you cannot stop until the last page. In all the cities, people is walking in the streets, bumping into each other because their faces is buried in my book, and dentists is reading it and trying to fill teeth at the same time, but nobody minds because they is already reading it and two in the dentist chair. Drivers is reading it while driving, and cars is crashing all over the country. Brain surgeons is reading it while they is operating on brains, and airline pilots is reading it and going to Timbuktu instead of London. Football players is reading it on the field because they can't put it down, and so is Olympic runners while they is running. Everybody has to see what is going to happen next in my book, and when I wake up, I is still tingling with excitement at being the greatest writer the world has ever known until my mummy comes in and says, I was looking at your English exercise book last night, and really, your spelling is atrocious. So is your punctuation. That's enough for now, the BFG said. There is dillions more, but my arm is getting tired holding you up. Where are all those others over there? Sophie said. Why have they got such tiny labels? That, the BFG said, is because one day I is catching so many dreams I is not having the time or energy to write out long labels. But there is enough to remind me. Can I look? Sophie said. The long-suffering BFG carried her across to the jar she was pointing to. Sophie read them rapidly, one after the other. I is climbing Mount Everest with just my pussycat for company. I is inventing a car that runs on toothpaste. I is able to make the electric lights go on and off just by wishing it. I am only 8 years old, little boy, but I is growing a splendid bushy beard, and all the other boys is jealous. I is able to jump out of any high window and float down safely. I has a pet bee that makes rock and roll music when it flies. What amazes me, Sophie said, is how you ever learned to write in the first place. Ah, said the BFG, I has been wondering how long it is before you was asking me that. Considering you never went to school, I think it's quite marvelous, Sophie said. How did you learn? The BFG crossed the cave and opened a tiny secret door in the wall. He took out a book, very old and tattered. By human standards, it was an ordinary-sized book, but it looked like a postage stamp in his huge hand. One night, he said, I is blowing a dream through a window, and I seized the book lying on the little boy's bedroom table. I wanted it so very badly, you understand, but I is refusing to steal it. I would never do that.